Helen sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting long, slanted beams of light across her worn wood floors. She hadn't felt the need to wake up early for anything in weeks, but today, something had made her reach for her phone first thing. A notification from her bank flashed on the screen, an alert for a significant transaction, a sum that was higher than usual, one she didn't recognize. She scrolled through her account, her brow furrowing as more unfamiliar charges appeared. Small at first, then growing steadily more frequent. David. The thought crossed her mind quickly, as it always did now when there was something amiss. He had his hands in so many places. His debts, his emergencies. She tried to shake the feeling, but the nagging thought remained. This wasn't a coincidence. David. The phone shook slightly in her hand, her grip tightening as she clicked on the next transaction. She could feel her pulse picking up speed. Later that afternoon, Helen sat across from her son in the living room. The air was thick with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, a quiet contrast to the tension hanging between them. David had come over under the guise of checking in, but there was something in his eyes today, an edge she hadn't seen in weeks. She took a slow sip from her mug, her eyes never leaving him. "David," she began, her voice even, though her insides were anything but. "I've noticed some discrepancies in my bank accounts. Charges I don't recognize. Tell me what's going on." David chuckled, the sound low and easy. He leaned back in his chair, clearly unbothered. "Oh, Mom, come on. It's probably just your aging memory playing tricks on you again. You know how these things can get all mixed up." He waved a dismissive hand in the air, a smile tugging at his lips. Helen didn't smile back. Her heart thudded in her chest, the words echoing louder than the casual tone he used. Aging memory. How easily he dismissed her concerns, how effortlessly he tried to sidestep the truth. She could feel the anger building, but she kept it contained, letting the silence stretch out between them instead. "You're calling me senile?" Helen's words were measured, each one deliberate. David's smile faltered, just for a second. But it was enough. He cleared his throat, eyes shifting to the side. "I didn't mean it like that. But honestly, Mom, you need to take it easy. It's just a mistake." "A mistake." She repeated the words, feeling their weight. "This mistake has been going on for months, hasn't it? Only now, you're making jokes about it." David shrugged, unbothered. "I'm sure it's nothing. But you're right. I'll take another look at your finances when I get the chance. You know how things are, with work and all." Helen didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her mind calculating. This wasn't just a casual mistake, a slip-up. This was deliberate. She could see the cracks in his facade now, the shift in his eyes, the twitch of his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. This wasn't about aging memory. This was about something else entirely. After he left, Helen didn't waste any time. She knew what she had to do. Her fingers hovered over the phone as she stared at the screen, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. With a steady breath, she dialed the bank. The line clicked, and the automated voice prompted her through the usual steps, but she could barely focus on the words. Everything was secondary to the thoughts swirling in her mind, the realization that she had to act now, before things got worse. She spoke calmly to the representative, asking for a full review of her accounts, for any transactions she didn't authorize. As she listened to the details of the charges being explained to her, her mind spun. David's name, his typical spending patterns, it was all there. She wasn't imagining it. This had gone on for far too long. When the call ended, Helen placed the phone back on the table, feeling oddly numb. She needed to speak with her accountant, make sure everything was in order. The amount of money taken, the pattern, It was clear. But this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about control, and David had crossed a line. As the day wore on, Rachel called. Helen saw her daughter-in-law's name on the screen and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you doing?" Helen kept her voice steady, almost too calm. "I'm fine, Rachel. Just busy with some paperwork. David's been, well, a bit off lately," Rachel said, sounding uncertain. "He says everything's okay, but I'll handle it," Helen interrupted gently. "Don't worry about me, Rachel. I'm fine." Helen could hear the worry in Rachel's voice, the unspoken questions. But Helen wasn't ready to share everything just yet. For now, she needed to keep control of the situation, keep the focus where it needed to be. After she hung up, Helen sat in silence, staring at the papers spread out in front of her. The weight of the choices ahead pressed on her shoulders, but she knew one thing for sure now. She wasn't going to let this go. David had made his move, and now it was her turn. She picked up the phone again, this time dialing the number of her accountant. She had some calls to make, and a plan to put into motion. And as the phone rang, Helen Davis finally allowed herself to smile. It was a tight, cold smile, but it was the first sign of something she hadn't felt in months. Resolve. The game had just begun. Helen sat in the quiet of her study, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest like a heavy stone. The room was still, save for the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle matters alone, but this was something different. She needed advice. Her fingers hovered over the phone once again, and without hesitation, she dialed Fiona's number. The sharp sound of the line connecting seemed to slice through the thick silence. "Fiona Lee," came the calm voice on the other end. "Fiona." Helen's voice was steady, but a sense of purpose dripped from every word. "I need your help. It's about my son." There was a brief pause before Fiona responded, her tone alert. "Go on." "I've caught David taking money from my accounts. It's been going on for months. I need to know how to protect myself, legally and financially." Helen's fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, a nervous habit she couldn't control. "Understood," Fiona said, without hesitation. "First, we need to make sure your assets are safe. We can transfer them to a new, secure account, one that David doesn't know about." Helen's chest tightened, but she nodded, even though Fiona couldn't see her. "Do it." Fiona continued to outline the next steps, closing out certain accounts, setting up a more complex trust, moving the bulk of her assets where David couldn't touch them. She had done this before for wealthy clients, but there was something different now. This wasn't about securing a fortune, it was about something far more personal. It was about power, betrayal, and cutting the last remaining thread between Helen and the son who had betrayed her. Later, the transfer was done. Helen sat in her study, reviewing the details of the accounts, the new security measures, and the documents Fiona had sent over. The money was now safe. There would be no easy access for David, no hidden withdrawals. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The next steps weren't so clear. Fiona had advised her to let the confrontation simmer for a bit, but David wouldn't wait. He never did. Her phone buzzed across the desk, startling her. She glanced at the screen. David. Her heart sank just looking at his name. She wasn't ready for this, but she knew it was inevitable. She swiped the screen. "Mom, I need some money for a few bills. Could you help me out?" Helen's finger hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking steadily, as if it too was waiting for her response. She took a deep breath. She could already hear the tone in his voice, the pleading, the guilt-tripping, the manipulative undercurrent. He had done this before, but this time, she wasn't falling for it. She wasn't going to let him turn her generosity into a trap. With careful precision, she typed her response, "Not until we talk." She hit send before she could second guess herself, sitting back in her chair with a sense of finality. The ball was in his court now. The doorbell rang shortly after. It was Rachel. Helen had barely begun to process her conversation with David when she saw her daughter-in-law standing in the doorway. Rachel's expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to her calm demeanor that suggested she knew something wasn't right. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said softly, stepping into the entryway. "I thought I'd come by, see how things were going." Helen smiled thinly, gesturing for Rachel to sit. "Everything's fine, Rachel. Just catching up on some things." She motioned to the papers scattered on her desk, though she knew Rachel wasn't fooled. Rachel glanced at the papers, then back at Helen, sensing the tension in the air but wisely choosing not to press. "David's been a bit off lately," she said, her voice soft. "He keeps talking about how you're not helping him out like you used to." Helen's eyes flickered briefly to the phone, still sitting on the desk, the text from David fresh in her mind. She could feel the stirrings of anger not just for what David had done, but for the way Rachel always seemed to be caught between them, torn between loyalty to her husband and the woman who had raised him. "I'm just trying to keep things in order, Rachel," Helen said finally, folding her hands on the desk. "But David needs to understand that things have changed. I won't keep enabling him, not anymore." Rachel's gaze softened, but there was a hesitation there, as if she were about to say something more but thought better of it. Instead, she simply nodded, the unspoken words hanging in the space between them. Helen sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I've taken care of things, Rachel. Don't worry about me." For a long moment, Rachel studied her, then gave a slow nod. "Okay, Mom. Just don't shut everyone out, all right?" Helen didn't answer right away. She didn't know what to say to that. Rachel wasn't wrong. She had been shutting everyone out. But sometimes, that's what you had to do to protect yourself. After Rachel left, Helen was alone again, but the house felt more empty than before. She walked back to her desk, picking up the papers with a practiced hand. The legal documents were in order, the assets transferred, her plan set into motion. She wasn't sure what David would do next, but she had no illusions. He'd come for what he thought was his, what he believed was his right. And when that happened, she would be ready. The quiet hum of the house was now louder, filled with the tension of a battle yet to come. Helen glanced at the clock. Soon David would make his move. But Helen was no longer afraid. She was prepared, and in that, she found her strength. The phone buzzed again, and for a split second Helen's heart skipped a beat. But when she saw the text, she just smiled faintly. "David." She looked at the screen and typed her next message. "We will talk soon enough. But not today." She hit send. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she placed the phone back on the desk, the cold reality of the situation settling over her. She couldn't let it go on any longer. David had crossed a line, and now, he was pushing her into a corner. She could no longer rely on trust or family ties. She needed answers. Her mind clicked into focus as she thought of one name, Mark Stanton, a private investigator, a man who had helped her with legal matters in the past when things were simpler. But this was different. This wasn't a simple fraud case. This was her son. It was personal. With resolve, Helen picked up the phone and dialed the number that had been stored in her contacts for years. She could hear the familiar beep of the line connecting before a voice answered. "Mark Stanton." "It's Helen Davis," she said, her voice tight, controlled. "I need your help. I think my son's been stealing from me. I need you to look into his finances." There was a slight pause on the other end. Mark had always been one for a direct approach, and the change in tone signaled his recognition of the gravity of the situation. "I'll look into it, Helen. You've got my word." The line went dead, And Helen was left with only the faint hum of the house and the growing weight of her decision. A week passed, and Helen kept busy with the details of her financial security, documents, transfers, reassigning accounts. But in the back of her mind, she knew Mark was working on it, and she didn't have to wait long for the confirmation. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone rang again. Mark's name flashed on the screen. She swiped it, her heart already racing. Helen. Mark's voice was even, though she could sense the gravity behind it. I've looked into it. Your son's been withdrawing money from your accounts for months. It's not subtle, and it's not random. He's been siphoning funds in small amounts over time, making sure you don't catch on too quickly. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. How much? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. More than you'd think, Mark replied, the words heavy. He's been careful, but there's a pattern. I've got everything documented. It's all there. He's been using your account to pay off his debts, making it look like you're the one withdrawing. Helen leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. I knew it. I didn't want to believe it. Mark paused before responding. I'll send you the full report. But I suggest you confront him, Helen. He's not going to stop on his own. Helen closed her eyes, her thoughts spinning. She could feel the walls closing in around her. David had been manipulating her for so long, and she had been blind to it. Now, she had the truth. But the truth was a weapon, and she had to wield it carefully. Thank you, Mark. I'll be in touch. As the call ended, Helen sat in the quiet of the study, the weight of the situation pressing in. It was no longer about protecting David. It was about protecting herself, her future, her legacy. Later that day, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was David. Helen didn't have to pretend she was surprised. She had expected him to show up eventually. His charm was his weapon, but Helen had learned to guard herself against it. She opened the door, her face calm, her eyes cold. Mom, we need to talk, David said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. About what? Helen asked. Her voice flat. Money, I assume. David's eyes flickered, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to gauge her mood. I don't understand why you've been so distant lately. I've been struggling, and you're not helping. You know I'm in a tough spot. Helen folded her arms across her chest, leaning against the doorframe. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't noticed how you've been manipulating me? Taking money from my accounts? David's eyes narrowed and he shifted his weight uneasily. What are you talking about? Mom, I would never— Don't lie to me, she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I know what you've been doing, David. I've had everything checked. And I'm done. I won't let you steal from me anymore. David's face flushed with anger, but he tried to mask it with a thin smile. You're overreacting. You're not well, Mom. You've always been paranoid. I'm your son. I'm just trying to get by. Helen's jaw clenched and she stepped aside, her hand on the door to close it. You've taken enough. Now you'll take nothing. Not a penny. Not another ounce of my trust. David stood frozen for a moment, the words sinking in. Then, with a forced, bitter smile, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Helen stood still in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't care about the noise he made, the tantrum he threw. What mattered was that he had no access to her anymore. Just as the tension in the house seemed to dissipate, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lily, David's daughter. Helen hesitated for a moment before answering. Hi, Grandma, came Lily's voice, soft and uncertain. I don't understand. Why is Dad so angry? What's going on? Helen's mind raced, but she didn't want to add to the confusion. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice calm but distant. Your dad's angry because he's been caught, Lily. But don't worry about it. Just know that I'm taking care of things. Lily was silent for a moment. Okay, Grandma. I love you. Helen's heart twisted at the sweetness in her granddaughter's voice. I love you too, Lily. Always. As the call ended, Helen looked at the phone in her hand. The storm was just beginning, but she was ready now. Ready for the fight ahead. And David? He wouldn't be able to manipulate her any longer. The next move was hers to make. The afternoon light spilled into Helen's study, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floors. The room, once warm with the clutter of a busy life, now felt colder. The papers on her desk were neatly organized, every document a reminder of what was at stake. Her fingers lightly traced the edge of a folder, and her gaze moved over the financial statements she had meticulously gathered. The cracks in her family, the betrayals, everything she had once trusted had crumbled. It was time to solidify her defense. She had called Fiona earlier that morning, and now the estate attorney was sitting across from her at the polished oak table, reviewing her finances with a sharp, methodical focus. Fiona adjusted her glasses, eyes scanning the documents in front of her, and then she looked up. Helen, I've seen situations like this before. The first thing we need to do is make sure you have an airtight will and trust. You need to be clear about your intentions and your instructions. It's obvious David's been testing your limits. This stops now. Helen nodded, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood. I don't want him anywhere near my estate. Not after what he's done. Her voice, usually steady, carried an edge now. A steel edge that had only come through years of taking care of herself. He's already crossed a line. I won't let him take what's mine. Fiona smiled slightly, though it wasn't out of amusement. It was more a quiet acknowledgement of the strength Helen was displaying. Understood. We'll draft a new will, with language so clear that there's no room for misinterpretation. I can also start adjusting your living trust to reflect your new intentions. It's crucial to lock down your assets as quickly as possible. Helen leaned forward. I've spent my whole life building something I'm proud of. David. David thought he could take it from me. The words were clipped, filled with the anger that still simmered under the surface. Fiona didn't flinch. I'll make sure your wishes are followed. We'll protect everything, down to the smallest detail. Helen watched her attorney flip through the pages, marking places to add clauses, and she felt a fleeting sense of peace. But it was temporary. She still wasn't done. That evening, Helen sat alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by the papers she had been reviewing all day. The phone buzzed, startling her. It was Rachel. She had been avoiding her daughter-in-law's calls for a while now. Too much uncertainty, too many questions. But Rachel had a right to know what was happening, even if it was the last thing Helen wanted to do. With a slow, deliberate movement, she picked up the phone and answered. Hi, Mom. Rachel's voice was tentative, almost apologetic. I'm sorry for David. I know he's been difficult. He's been saying things, and I don't know what to think. Helen felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about Rachel, too. She hadn't wanted to drag her into this, but Rachel was family. And sometimes, the truth had to be faced, no matter how much it hurt. David's actions have made it clear to me that I can't trust him anymore, Helen said, keeping her voice steady, though a hint of sadness crept in. I've had to make some decisions, Rachel. Hard decisions. I can't let him control everything any longer. I've changed my will. I've made sure everything is protected. Everything he can't touch. There was a long pause on the other end, the silence stretching thin between them. I get it, Mom, Rachel finally said, her voice soft but filled with an undeniable sadness. But, do you think David will ever understand? He's not right. I know that. But he's still my husband. He's Lily's father. I just don't know if... if it's all worth it. Cutting him out completely. I'm not cutting him out for fun, Rachel, Helen interrupted gently. I'm cutting him out to protect myself. And you too. He's already tried to steal from me. He has no respect for boundaries. You don't know how deep this goes, but I'm done letting him manipulate me. It's time to put an end to it. Rachel's sigh was heavy. I don't want to see our family torn apart. I just want things to go back to normal. Helen's heart ached at her daughter-in-law's words, but she knew there was no going back. I know you want that, Rachel. But David's made his choices. And now, I'm making mine. Another pause lingered, this time uncomfortable. Okay, Mom, Rachel said softly. I hope you know what you're doing. I do, Helen replied, the firmness in her voice unmistakable. I have to do this. For me. The conversation ended and Helen sat quietly for a moment. Rachel's doubt still hung in the air, but Helen couldn't afford to let it sway her. David had shown his true colors, and now she would protect what was hers. Helen stood up and moved to the desk, gathering the papers with a steady hand. The changes to her trust were already underway. It was clear that her son had underestimated her, assuming that she would always be there to catch him when he fell. But the truth was, she had never been more prepared to stand on her own. She picked up the pen, her fingers wrapping around it like a weapon. The decisions she was making now were final. There would be no going back. With a firm hand, she began to sign the documents. As she signed her name, her thoughts drifted to Lily. She didn't want her granddaughter to be caught in the middle of this, but Helen had no illusions anymore. The storm was coming, and the only way to weather it was to stand firm. The papers were signed, the trust was adjusted, and Helen felt a small sense of closure, a peace she hadn't known in months. But as she placed the pen down, she couldn't shake the feeling that David was already plotting his next move. And this time, Helen would be ready. The game had changed, and she would play it to win. The rain tapped softly against the windows, a muted soundtrack to Helen's thoughts as she sat in her study. Papers strewn out before her like a battlefield. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting the moments as she flipped through legal documents, each page filled with a decision that weighed on her shoulders. The weight of the past few weeks had become something she could no longer ignore. Her fingers paused over the power of attorney form. For the past several years, David had been listed as her agent, a decision she had made out of love, out of the belief that family was sacred, that it would always be family. But now, that trust had been shattered. The betrayal had cut deeper than she could have anticipated. He had tried to take more than just money. He had tried to take her autonomy. Helen's hand tightened around the pen, the smooth click of the cap echoing in the room. With a steady hand, she drew a line through David's name. She wrote Rachel's in its place, the decision final. This was the first step, finalizing the boundaries that David had crossed long ago. It was no longer just about protecting her assets. It was about reclaiming control over her own life. She let the pen drop, her gaze lingering on the form. This was more than just legal formalities. It was a declaration of her resolve. Rachel, despite the tensions and the doubts she harbored, was the one she trusted now. She had shown a kind of quiet strength in her uncertainty. David had shown nothing but manipulation and greed. Helen stood and walked to her filing cabinet, pulling out the folder where she had documented every conversation, every interaction, every bit of evidence she had gathered over the past months. She had kept track of it all, the trail of deceit too clear to ignore any longer. The photos of transactions, the notes from Mark's investigation, the texts from David, all of it was meticulously organized. She had documented it for one reason: she would not be caught off guard again. As she worked, the phone buzzed on the table. It was Rachel. Helen stared at it for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." Rachel's voice was careful, wary. I need to talk to you about something." David's been pushing me. He's asking for your help again. He won't let it go. Helen's jaw tightened. She had expected this. David wasn't one to give up easily. Rachel, she began, her voice low and controlled. You don't have to help him. I've made it clear that I won't support him anymore. He's made his choices. And now, I'm making mine. I know, Mom. I know. Rachel's voice cracked slightly. But he's your son. He says you're shutting him out completely, that you're leaving him with nothing. Helen's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not leaving him with nothing. I'm leaving him with the consequences of his actions. He's been stealing from me, Rachel. That's not something I can overlook. There was a long pause before Rachel spoke again, softer this time. I don't want to lose you, Mom. But I can't be caught in the middle of this. I have to take a step back. I can't keep trying to fix things that David won't fix himself. Helen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her daughter-in-law's words. Rachel was caught between love and obligation. But Helen couldn't change what had happened. She couldn't change the man David had become, and she couldn't allow herself to be dragged down by his manipulations any longer. I understand, Rachel, she said finally, her voice steady. You don't have to choose sides. I've made my decision. I'm cutting him off completely. The only person who can change this now is David, but he has to face the consequences. There was a deep sigh on the other end of the line. I just hope you know what you're doing. This isn't easy for any of us. Helen felt a pang of sadness, but it was buried beneath the steel of her resolve. I know, Rachel, but I have to protect myself. And my future. I've been living in denial for too long. She hung up, her fingers lingering on the phone before she placed it back on the table. Her next task was a letter, one she had been dreading, but knew she had to write. She picked up the pen again, the action mechanical, but purposeful. The letter was short, to the point, and unyielding. There would be no more second chances, no more excuses. David, I've had enough. You've betrayed my trust in ways I never imagined possible. I've made the decision to cut all financial ties with you. I will not support you any longer. I've transferred everything to a secure account, and I've updated my will and trust. You are no longer part of my financial future. This is final. You can no longer manipulate me into giving you what you want. I am not the mother you think I am. You've lost my trust, and that's something you can never regain. Do not contact me again unless it's to apologize for your actions. Helen. She set the pen down, her heart pounding in her chest. The finality of her words rang in her ears. It was done. The line had been drawn. Later that night, Helen sat in front of the fire, staring at the letter in front of her. The weight of what she had just done didn't hit her until now. This was the moment where there was no turning back. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She knew who it was before she even opened it. David. She couldn't avoid this confrontation any longer, but this time, she would be ready. Helen stood at the doorway, her pulse steady despite the storm that raged inside her. The letter she had written was tucked safely into her desk drawer, but the finality of her decision was still raw, still heavy in her hands. She had made her choice, and now David was at her doorstep. The knock echoed through the house, sharp and insistent. A second passed, then another. She could hear his breath on the other side of the door, the weight of his presence pressing against her resolve. She didn't need to open it to know what he wanted. Money, answers, control. With a sigh, Helen turned the handle and opened the door. There he stood. The same familiar face, though twisted now with anger and desperation. David's eyes flickered with something darker than frustration, but Helen didn't flinch. Mom, David began, his voice tight with forced calm. I need access to the account, now. Helen's gaze held steady, her posture unyielding. No, David, You've lost access. I've made it clear. This isn't about you anymore. David's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Helen saw the man she had once trusted. A man who, beneath all the deception and manipulation, had once been her son. But now, he was nothing but a stranger in her home. "You're making a huge mistake," David continued, his voice rising slightly, trying to find that old familiar hook, the one that always reeled her back in. "I've been struggling, Mom. You know that. I need that money to pay off bills. Don't do this. Don't push me away." Helen stood firm, her eyes cold and unwavering. "You've already pushed me away, David. By stealing from me, by manipulating me. This is the result of your actions. I can't keep enabling you." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. David's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and rage. He took a step forward, but Helen didn't budge. "Come on, Mom. I'm your son," he spat, his voice tinged with something dangerous. "You can't just shut me out like this. You can't just cut me off. I've always been there for you, haven't I?" Helen's heart didn't race. It didn't even stutter. The words he used, the ones that had once made her feel guilty for wanting boundaries, no longer had power over her. "I've always been there for you, David. But that's not the same as enabling you," she replied coolly, her voice clipped. "You've crossed a line, and now, there's no going back." David's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked as if he might strike out. At her, at the situation, at the years of manipulation he had relied on. But something in Helen's unflinching gaze stopped him. The game had changed, and he knew it. "You're pushing me away," he said finally, his voice low and almost pleading, but it held no real sincerity. "You can't do this. You'll regret it. I'm your son. I need you, Mom." Helen felt a flicker of something deep within her, something that had once been love, but was now tempered by a hard, unrelenting clarity. "I don't trust you anymore, David. Not after what you've done. Not after all the lies, the deceit. Apologies don't undo that." His face reddened, a flush of anger rising in his throat. "You think I'm the only one who's been wrong here? You think you're perfect? You've always been so independent, so cold. You've always pushed me away, and now you're doing it again." His words were a twisted echo of what he had said years ago, but now they felt like empty threats. Helen's shoulders straightened. "I'm not pushing you away, David. You're pushing yourself away. You made your choices. You made your bed. Now, you'll lie in it." The room hung in the tension that stretched between them, his desperation, her resolve. David tried to take another step toward her, but this time it wasn't her who moved. It was him who faltered, unsure, caught in the reality that Helen had become a person he no longer recognized. She was done. She had fought for him long enough. Now, she was fighting for herself. "I won't let you manipulate me anymore," Helen said, her voice hardening. "And I'm not going to let you ruin my future. This is final, David." David stood there for a long moment, his eyes blazing with unspoken anger, but no more words came. He opened his mouth, as though trying to think of something to say that would shift the tide, but nothing came. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Helen stood there, staring at the closed door, her pulse steady. The finality of it washed over her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of peace. But even as the silence of the house settled back into place, she knew that this was only the beginning. David would be back. He would never give up without a fight. But Helen had made her decision. She had drawn the line, and this time she would not back down. As the rain continued to fall outside, Helen walked back to her desk. The room now empty, except for the faint sound of her breath and the soft click of her pen. The game had changed, and she was ready. The heavy rain outside had softened to a steady drizzle, its rhythmic tapping on the window like a lullaby that kept the house calm. But inside, the air was thick with purpose. Helen sat at her desk, surrounded by the papers she had spent the last few weeks meticulously organizing. Each document, each signature, was a step in the direction of her future, a future no longer dependent on David's manipulation. Her eyes scanned the trust documents, already prepared but still requiring final adjustments. She had spent hours drafting them with Fiona, ensuring that every detail was in place. It was a complicated web of legal language, but it was also her lifeline. She had worked too long, too hard, to have it slip through her fingers now. Helen tapped the edge of her pen against the paper, thinking back to the life she had built. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been hers. Every penny she had earned, every investment, every piece of jewelry, everything had been part of a foundation she had created with dignity and care. David had wanted to destroy it, but now it would be safeguarded. She made a call to Fiona, her estate lawyer, as the weight of the decision sank in further. "Fiona, I've made the changes to the trust," she began, her voice steady. "I want to ensure everything is completely ironclad, no loopholes, no way David can get his hands on anything." "I'll review it immediately," Fiona's voice replied with calm assurance. "We'll make sure it's locked down tight. There's no room for error." Helen hung up the phone and allowed herself a brief moment of relief. She could feel the years of tension start to loosen. For the first time in months, she was beginning to feel secure again, secure in her decisions, secure in her actions. The doorbell rang shortly after, pulling her from her thoughts. Helen glanced at the clock. It was Rachel, just as she expected. The two of them hadn't spoken much since the confrontation with David. Rachel had been quiet, unsure of where she stood in all of this, but Helen knew she needed to address it. Rachel walked in slowly, her expression more guarded than usual. She was holding a small bag, and her eyes flickered nervously between Helen and the chair across the room. "Hi, Mom," Rachel greeted softly, sitting down without waiting to be asked. There was a tightness in her voice, a lingering discomfort that Helen knew wasn't just about the estate. It was about everything. "Hi, Rachel," Helen replied evenly, looking up from her papers. "How are you?" Rachel hesitated, then exhaled slowly as though gathering the courage to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've done, and I'm just worried, okay? This whole thing with David, the way you've cut him out of everything, it's a lot." Helen leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "I know it's hard for you. I know you're torn. But I've made my decision. He's crossed a line I can't ignore anymore." Rachel nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment. "I get that. I do, but what happens if he gets worse? If he tries to do something desperate?" Helen could feel the concern radiating from her daughter-in-law, but she remained resolute. "Then I'll deal with it, Rachel. But I'm not going to live in fear anymore. Not of him. Not of anyone." The silence hung between them for a moment, both women lost in their thoughts. Then, Rachel spoke again, quieter this time. "You've made sure everything is secure, right?" she asked, looking up. "I mean, what if something happens? What if—" "Everything is in place," Helen interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "The trust, the accounts, everything has been transferred. It's locked down. I've made sure of it." Rachel exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay, I just needed to hear that." Helen reached out, placing a hand on Rachel's. "I've always wanted what's best for you, Rachel. And for Lily. You don't have to worry about anything. I've made sure everything will be taken care of." Rachel nodded, her expression softening just a little. "I know, I don't know how all this will affect Lily. I don't want her to feel like she's caught in the middle." Helen smiled faintly, her thumb brushing lightly against Rachel's hand. She won't be caught in the middle. I'm going to make sure she's taken care of, just like I always planned. There's nothing for you to worry about. Rachel was silent for a moment, her eyes filling with something like understanding, or maybe resignation. Then she squeezed Helen's hand and stood up. Okay, I'll trust you on this, Mom. I just I just hope we can get through this without it tearing us apart. Helen nodded, watching her daughter-in-law leave. The door clicked softly behind her, and Helen was left alone again in the quiet of her study. Her fingers hovered over the papers once more, the trust documents now signed, sealed, and prepared for the future. It was a trust, yes, but it was also a statement. A message to everyone, including David. She would no longer be manipulated. She would no longer be vulnerable. A few hours later, Helen found herself standing in front of her safe, the cool metal door gleaming under the soft light of the room. She opened it carefully, revealing the velvet-lined compartments where her most precious possessions were now locked away. She gently placed her jewelry, the heirlooms that had been passed down through generations, into a newly opened trust fund for her grandchildren. It was a gesture of love, a promise for the future, her future, their future. The evening passed quietly, and as the sun began to set, Helen sat down in her favorite chair by the fire, a book in her lap. The crackling flames cast a warm glow across the room, but Helen's thoughts were far from the warmth. The peace she'd worked so hard to build was finally in her grasp. She could breathe again. But even as she leaned back, a flicker of doubt lingered in the back of her mind. David would come for what he believed was his. He would find a way to get through to her. And when he did, Helen would be ready. But for now, she allowed herself one quiet moment, holding on to the certainty that the trust she had built was stronger than the storm she knew was coming. The battle wasn't over, but she had made sure the foundation was unbreakable. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Helen's study. She sat at her desk, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on her chest, but there was a certain peace in the stillness. The storm had passed. For now. Her fingers hovered over her phone, the cold metal of it a reminder of the distance between her and David. His name still lingered in her contacts, and for a moment she considered deleting it. But then, she remembered. This wasn't about erasing him from her life. It was about taking control. So instead, she opened the text thread that had become an unwelcome reminder of her son's manipulations. Her heart tightened as she typed her message, short, firm, final. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. No more access, no more trust. She hit send, the words sharp, clean, final. There was no room for doubt, no second chances. Helen set the phone down, her fingers trembling slightly as the reality of her decision settled in her bones. She had cut the cord. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. She knew David would try to reach her. He always did. But this time, she was ready. She had been preparing for this moment for months. Every decision, every legal document, every cold step leading to this inevitable confrontation. It didn't take long for David to respond. His first message came an hour later, a simple plea. Mom, please. What's going on? Why are you doing this to me? Helen didn't even look at the phone. She had expected it. She knew what he would say. She didn't need to respond. Not anymore. A few hours later, another message came through, more urgent this time. You can't do this. I'm your son. You're making a huge mistake. Please, let's talk. I need you. I'm sorry for everything. Just give me a chance to make it right. Helen stared at the message for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her desk. She could feel the pull of old habits, the voice of the mother who had always forgiven, always given him one more chance. But that part of her, quiet, passive, accommodating, was gone. It had died the moment she saw the proof, the betrayal, the manipulation. With a deep breath, she locked the phone and turned it face down on the table. By the time Rachel called, Helen had already decided to focus on the next step. The next chapter of her life was not going to be one defined by fear or guilt, but Rachel's call still caught her off guard. "Hi, Mom." Rachel's voice was soft, cautious. "I've been thinking about everything. David's been texting you, hasn't he? He's really pushing. And I know, Rachel," Helen interrupted gently but firmly. "He's doing exactly what I expected. Trying to guilt me, manipulate me. But I'm not falling for it this time." Rachel paused, and Helen could feel the weight of her daughter-in-law's concern on the other end. "I'm not so sure he knows how to stop, Mom. I've seen him do this before, but it's different now. He's getting desperate. It's like he's pushing everyone away." Helen leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting on the cool surface of her desk. "It's not my job to fix him anymore, Rachel. I've tried for years. I've been giving him chances to make things right, and all he's done is take advantage of me. But he's your son. Don't you think this is tearing him apart?" Helen felt a twinge of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by the steadiness of her resolve. "Maybe. But it's tearing me apart too, Rachel, and I can't keep doing this. I have to let go. It's the only way forward." Rachel was silent for a moment, her voice heavy when she finally spoke. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I just don't want us to lose each other over this." Helen's heart tightened, but she couldn't afford to let it sway her. "We won't lose each other, Rachel. I'll be here for you and Lily. But I can't keep living my life for David. Not anymore." As the days passed, Helen found herself surrounded by a quiet strength she hadn't known in years. Friends and family rallied around her, offering support and understanding. Her closest friends reached out, letting her know they were there. No judgment, just solidarity. It was a comfort, but also a reminder of the stark contrast between the world she had tried to protect and the one she was now stepping into. Her health, once plagued by the constant stress of David's manipulations, started to improve. She slept better, ate better. Her days no longer felt like a series of anxious calculations. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without the weight of worry pressing on her chest. The phone buzzed again late one night, a message from David. "I can't believe you're doing this. You're hurting everyone. You're alone. And you'll regret it." Helen's fingers hovered over the phone, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. David's attempts to guilt her, to break through the walls she had built, fell flat. Each message felt more empty than the last. He had no power over her anymore. Helen turned off her phone, setting it face down on the nightstand, and closed her eyes. She had made her decision, and now she was free. But even as the relief settled over her, she couldn't ignore the feeling that David's next move was already in motion. She would be ready. The game was far from over, but this time, the rules had changed. And Helen Davis would play to win. The soft chime of her phone broke the quiet of Helen's study, and she knew without looking that it was David. He had been relentless, but she had been resolute, each message he sent like a fading echo of the manipulations that once held her captive. This time, however, it wasn't a message. This time, it was something more official. Helen read the letter carefully, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the words. "Cease and desist. Accusations of financial manipulation. Immediate demands for restitution." The letter, sent from David's lawyer, claimed she had unjustly frozen his access to her accounts and accused her of fraudulent behavior. It was a final, desperate act of retaliation. Her grip on the letter tightened, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the legal battle that had always been inevitable. Helen set the letter down on the desk and exhaled slowly. The game had changed. She was no longer the one on the defensive. The following days were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Helen sat in Fiona's office, surrounded by stacks of papers, each one a testament to the meticulous documentation she had kept over the years. She wasn't going to let David twist the narrative. She had everything she needed: the bank statements, the transaction records, the proof of his theft. David's lawyer can accuse all he wants, Fiona said, flipping through the legal documents. But we have him on record, Helen. Every move he made, every penny he took, it's here. We're going to make sure the court sees it all. Helen nodded, her face set with determination. I won't let him get away with this. Not this time. Fiona paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked over the papers. We'll need to be prepared for a long fight. David's going to try to paint you as the villain, claim you're manipulating him. But we've got the facts. We've got the truth on our side. Helen stood up, her posture unwavering. I've been manipulated for too long. Now it's his turn to face the consequences. The court battle loomed large, but in the midst of it all, the media had caught wind of the dispute. What had once been a quiet family issue became a public spectacle. Headlines flashed across news sites and TV screens, casting Helen as the victim of a greedy son who had attempted to exploit her for his own gain. The story painted a stark contrast: the determined, independent mother standing up to her manipulative son. The narrative was simple, clean, and compelling, and it quickly gained traction. Interviews with her lawyer and close friends painted Helen in a light she hadn't expected: a strong woman protecting her legacy. But not everyone was so sure. Rachel, still caught in the middle, reached out again. This time, her voice was filled with conflict. I don't know, Mom, Rachel said, her tone hesitant. The media is making it look like David is the bad guy, and I just don't know how I feel about it all. I've been talking to some of his friends, and they say he's struggling. He's broken. Helen's heart ached for Rachel. She could hear the worry in her voice, the loyalty pulling her in two directions. David made his choices, Rachel. He knew the consequences of his actions, and I'm not going to let him tear my life apart any longer. I know, Rachel whispered, but there was doubt in her words, a hesitation that lingered. But it's not that simple, is it? Helen's grip on the phone tightened. She knew Rachel wasn't ready to fully see the truth. I wish it were, sweetheart. But sometimes we have to let go of the people who hurt us. And I've done everything I could for David. It's his turn to fix things, if he ever can. The days following the legal filings were a whirlwind. Helen had prepared herself for the scrutiny, but nothing had fully prepared her for the feeling of the world watching her. She had built her life on a foundation of hard work and integrity, and now that foundation was being tested. But the further she went, the stronger her resolve grew. Rachel, caught in the storm, had slowly started to withdraw, her doubts giving way to a harsh new reality. The more she saw of David's actions, his manipulation, his desperation, the more she began to see her husband for what he was. The woman who had always been in the middle was now finding herself on the periphery. Helen kept moving forward, not for David, not for Rachel, but for herself. She was reclaiming her future. The quiet strength she had always carried was now her greatest weapon. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from David or Rachel. It was a notification. Her book, written during these years of struggle, was gaining attention. The media coverage had sparked interest, and publishers were calling. The book on financial independence, legacy planning, and the strength to stand up for yourself was being picked up. Her words, once meant only for herself, were now reaching a wider audience. Helen smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of the screen. She had built a legacy that was more than just wealth. It was a message. No matter how difficult the fight, no matter how deep the betrayal, You could always rebuild. You could always start again. The courtroom battle was just beginning, but Helen had already won. She had reclaimed her life, her future, and her peace. David, for all his attempts to manipulate and destroy, was no longer the center of her world. And as Helen stared out of the window, watching the storm clouds part, she realized that no matter what came next, she was ready for it. She had built something unshakable, something even David couldn't touch. This was just the beginning. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with the weight of the case unfolding before them. Helen sat upright in the witness stand, the morning sun creeping through the narrow windows, casting a soft light across the polished wood of the courtroom. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, and she held her breath just long enough to steady her nerves. She had prepared for this moment, for the questions, for the accusations, for the confrontation that had been brewing for months. But now that it was here, it was almost anticlimactic. David's lawyer stood at the far end of the courtroom, his face a mask of calculated professionalism. He had spent the morning attempting to paint Helen as a heartless manipulator, casting doubt on her every move. But Helen didn't flinch. She didn't need to. The truth was on her side, and the truth was unassailable. The judge, an older man with glasses perched low on his nose, shuffled through a pile of papers in front of him, his eyes skimming over the details of the case. He was a seasoned professional, unfazed by the theatrics, and Helen knew this was a battle of facts, not feelings. "Ms. Davis," the judge said, his voice steady but kind, "you've heard the accusations against you. Your son claims that you've manipulated his finances and that his access to your estate was unjustly restricted. How do you respond?" Helen took a deep breath, glancing briefly at David's lawyer. His eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty, but Helen's gaze never wavered. She turned back to the judge, her voice calm but firm. "I've worked hard my entire life to build what I have," she began, her words measured. "Every decision I made regarding my finances was made with the intention of protecting my legacy, not just for myself, but for my family. When I discovered that my son had been stealing from me, I had no choice but to take action. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Behind Helen, her lawyer, Fiona, sat with her arms crossed, watching the proceedings with quiet confidence. She had been the steady hand guiding Helen through this process, and Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. It had been a long road, but it was one she had navigated with clarity, determination, and the kind of inner strength that David had never understood. David's lawyer rose, his suit crisply tailored, his voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "Your Honor, Ms. Davis's actions are nothing short of cruel. She's chosen to turn her back on her own son, to cut him out of a future that he rightfully deserves. He has admitted his mistakes. He's apologized for his behavior. This is nothing more than an overreaction. What Ms. Davis is doing here is not about protecting her estate. It's about punishing her own flesh and blood." Helen's heart twisted, but only briefly. She had heard it all before: the guilt trips, the empty apologies, the false remorse. David had used them all to manipulate her in the past, but today, they didn't hold the same power. "Mr. Jensen," Helen said, her voice cold and cutting, "I'm not punishing my son. I'm protecting my future. And his actions, his repeated theft, his deceit, left me with no choice but to act." The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but the judge raised his hand, silencing him. "We've heard enough," the judge said. "Let's move on to the next witness." Helen's heart skipped a beat as Rachel stood up from her seat, her face pale but determined. The tension in the courtroom thickened, and for a brief moment, Helen felt the weight of the situation settle into her bones. Rachel was caught in the middle, torn between the man she loved and the woman who had always been there for her. Helen couldn't help but feel the pain of what this had cost Rachel. Rachel walked to the witness stand, her gaze flicking nervously between the judge and the jury. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the emotion behind her words. "I've seen my husband manipulate my mother-in-law for years," Rachel began, her voice shaking. "David has always found a way to get what he wanted, even if it meant taking advantage of people who loved him. I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought I could fix things. But when I saw the proof, when I saw the transactions and heard the lies, I couldn't deny it any longer. I stand by my mother-in-law today because she did the right thing. She protected herself. She protected her future." Helen's throat tightened, and for the first time in days, she felt tears sting her eyes. Rachel's words, once filled with doubt and conflict, were now filled with clarity and strength. Helen's heart swelled with pride. Rachel had finally seen the truth. The final moments of the trial were a blur. Helen had no need to retaliate or attack David. Her dignity shone through as she refused to stoop to his level. The judge listened intently, reviewing the evidence, the testimonies, and the facts laid out before him. Helen had made her case. The truth was undeniable. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke again. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing the testimony of all involved, the court rules in favor of Ms. Davis. The actions of her son David were indeed manipulative and unlawful. The access to her estate remains restricted, and all legal measures to protect her financial independence will remain in place. Helen's breath caught in her throat. It was over. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear of losing everything, was finally lifted. David's lawyer sat back in his chair, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. David, on the other hand, was still standing at the back of the courtroom, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. He had lost, and so had his plan to seize control of her estate. Helen walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, surrounded by Fiona, Rachel, and a few close friends who had stood by her through this difficult journey. There was a sense of finality now, a peace that she hadn't known in years. The battle wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming her life, her autonomy, and her future. And in the end, she had won. David would never have control over her again. Helen took a deep breath as she stepped into the sunlight, her gaze steady and unwavering. The road ahead was still long, but it was hers to walk. And this time she would walk it alone, but not defeated. The game had changed, and she had claimed victory. Helen sat at her desk, the room quiet except for the soft click of the pen in her hand. Her eyes traced the familiar lines of her writing pad, the paper almost too pristine for what she was about to do. It had been weeks since the trial ended, weeks since the final judgment was handed down. But even now, the finality of it all felt surreal. She had won. And yet, there was still one last thing she needed to do. David's name, still sitting in her contacts, felt like a ghost in her phone. A reminder of the son she had once loved, a son who had crossed every line, betrayed her trust, and tried to take everything from her. He had manipulated her, guilt-tripped her, and played on every emotion she had. But that was over now. She had drawn the line. She could feel the weight of her decision as she opened a new document. The letter she had been putting off. The final word she would speak to him. She had already cut him out of her life. Legally, financially, emotionally. But this letter would make it official. The moment she put it on paper, it would be real. Her fingers moved across the page, each word precise, the finality in her writing clear. David, I've tried to give you every chance to redeem yourself, to make things right. But your actions have left me with no other choice. After everything you've done, the lies, the manipulation, the deceit, You've permanently removed yourself from my life. I won't tolerate it anymore. You've lost my trust, and that is something you can never regain. From this moment forward, there will be no contact between us. I have made the necessary legal and financial changes to ensure my future is protected, and you will never have access to it again. This is not an act of cruelty. It is a decision for my own peace, my own well-being. You will never be part of my life again. This is final. Helen paused after signing her name, feeling the weight of the words settle over her. She had said everything that needed to be said. There would be no more chances, no more excuses. She was done. She folded the letter carefully, her fingers brushing the edges as she placed it into an envelope. For a moment she hesitated, thinking of Rachel. The last few months had been a delicate balance between the two of them. The loyalty Rachel felt for David conflicting with the undeniable truth of what he had done. Helen knew Rachel was still struggling, but she had to trust that, in time, Rachel would see it too, that this was the only way forward. The phone buzzed, and Helen saw Rachel's name on the screen. With a deep breath, she answered. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said softly, her voice still carrying that weight of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about everything you said. I know it's hard for me to fully understand, but you've been through so much. I just want you to know that I'm not trying to choose sides, but I need you to know I see how much this has cost you." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, letting her daughter-in-law's words wash over her. She could hear the struggle in Rachel's voice, the pull of a love she didn't want to sever, and the painful realization of the truth. "I know this isn't easy, Rachel," Helen said, her voice steady but soft. "But David's actions speak for themselves. I've done all I can for him. I've given him every chance. Now it's my turn to protect myself, to protect my future." "I understand," Rachel whispered, the words thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, I don't want to lose you too." Helen's chest tightened. "You won't lose me. But you need to know, Rachel, this is the only way forward. For both of us. You've seen how he manipulates. You've felt it too. This isn't just about money. It's about my peace." There was a long silence on the other end. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was softer, more resolute. "I'll stand by you, Mom. I hope David will understand one day. I really do." Helen felt a knot loosen in her chest. She had hoped for this moment, the moment Rachel would see that her choices were not out of malice, but out of necessity. Later that afternoon, Helen found herself at the bank, the same place where so many of her decisions had begun. She walked past the rows of offices, each one a reminder of the life she had built, the life that was now securely under her control. The banker, a quiet young woman who had worked with Helen for years, greeted her with a soft smile. "Ms. Davis, it's good to see you. How can I help today?" Helen walked up to the counter and set the papers down in front of the woman. "I just want to make sure everything is in order. My accounts, everything. I want it all under my name. No exceptions." The banker nodded, her hands moving efficiently over the documents. "Of course, Ms. Davis. I'll make sure everything is transferred over and updated right away." Helen stood by the counter, watching the process unfold. There was a sense of peace in the air, a feeling of control that had been missing for so long. The final step had been taken. David would never have access to her finances, her legacy, or her life again. That evening, as Helen sat in her favorite chair by the fire, the quiet crackling of the logs was a soothing companion to her thoughts. The house felt different now, less like a battleground and more like a sanctuary. She felt safe here again. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Lily, David's daughter. Helen opened it with a smile. "Hi, Grandma. I just wanted to tell you how much I admire your strength. You've always been there for me, and I hope I can be as strong as you one day. Love, Lily." Helen's heart swelled, the words a balm for the scars that still lingered. This was why she had fought. This was why she had stood her ground. For Lily, for the future, for herself. Helen leaned back, her gaze steady and calm. Her life was hers again, and this time she would not let anyone take it from her. The final word had been spoken, and the rest of her life was hers to live. The early morning light bathed Helen's study in a soft golden hue, filling the room with warmth that contrasted the storm that had raged in her life for the past several months. She sat at her desk, the pages of her estate documents spread out before her. Her fingers gently traced the edges of the papers, documents that now held more than just legal and financial details. They were a reflection of everything she had fought for: her independence, her peace, and the legacy she had built with her own hands. Helen had made the necessary changes, ensuring that her future, her wealth, and everything she had worked for was safe. The legal battle had been fought and won, and now her estate was secured. She wasn't just protecting her money, she was protecting her story, her autonomy. But there was one last thing to do. One final touch to ensure that her legacy wasn't just about herself. Her husband, Tom, had passed away years ago, but his memory was still alive in every corner of the house. She had promised him that their work together, his vision of helping others, would not be forgotten. And now, with her newfound clarity and strength, she could finally honor that promise. Helen picked up the pen with a renewed sense of purpose and signed the final papers, officially establishing a scholarship fund in Tom's name. It would support students pursuing education in the arts, something they had both cared about deeply. She imagined the students who would benefit from it, those who wouldn't have had the chance without this help, who would carry Tom's legacy forward in ways neither of them could have imagined. The scholarship wasn't just a tribute to him. It was a part of her too, a part of the person she had become through all the trials and struggles. She had worked for this, and now it would continue to give long after she was gone. Rachel visited the next afternoon, and as Helen looked at her daughter-in-law, she saw the shift in her eyes. The uncertainty that had clouded Rachel's expressions for so long was gone, replaced by something more grounded, more understanding. The lines between loyalty and truth had finally blurred for Rachel, and Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. "I've been thinking a lot," Rachel said, sitting down across from Helen, "about everything you've done, about David, about us. I see now why you had to do it. I couldn't understand at first. I wanted to believe things could go back to normal, but they can't." Helen nodded, her gaze softening. "I know, sweetheart. I never wanted this. But some things can't be fixed, and I had to protect myself." Rachel reached over, placing her hand gently over Helen's. "I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. You were right, and I was too afraid to admit it. I've spent so much time trying to keep peace, but you can't keep peace when someone is willing to destroy it." Helen's heart swelled with gratitude. She hadn't expected Rachel to come to terms with everything so quickly, but in the quiet strength of their shared understanding, she found the foundation of something stronger. Their relationship had weathered a storm, but it had emerged with a new strength, built on truth and mutual respect. A few weeks later, Helen received a visit from Lily. The young woman stood at the doorstep, her bags packed and ready to go off to college. The last time they had spoken, Lily had expressed her admiration for Helen's strength, but now, seeing the young woman stand before her, Helen felt something deeper. Lily was no longer the little girl she had once known. She was growing into a woman, ready to take on the world. "Grandma," Lily said softly, her voice filled with the gravity of the moment. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. You've been through so much, and you've still kept going. I don't know if I'd have your strength, but I know I want to try." Helen smiled, feeling the weight of her past struggles fade as she looked into Lily's eyes. "You have more strength than you think, Lily. I see it in you every time you face a challenge. You're going to do amazing things." They shared a long, quiet hug, and Helen realized that this was the legacy she had worked so hard to protect. Not just her wealth or her name, but the love, the wisdom, the strength she could pass on to the next generation. The weeks that followed were filled with small, quiet moments. Helen had found a sense of peace she had never known before. She started volunteering at a local charity, a small organization that helped struggling artists get their start. It wasn't about the money. It was about doing something that mattered, something that gave her a sense of purpose beyond the walls of her home. It was a way to honor both Tom and her own path. She could help others, just as they had once helped her, when she was starting out in life. One afternoon, as Helen walked through the halls of the charity, talking to a few of the young artists, she felt something inside her shift. It wasn't just the fulfillment of her work, it was the peace that came with knowing she had fought for everything she had. She had faced her darkest fears, confronted betrayal, and come out the other side stronger than ever. And in doing so, she had preserved not just her wealth, but her soul. The storm had passed, and now the sun was shining brightly. Helen sat down at her desk one evening, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating the papers before her, records of the charity, her personal finances, the scholarship fund she had established, and the love she had so fiercely protected. She felt a quiet satisfaction in every document she reviewed. It wasn't just about the things she had secured, it was about the life she had built, the choices she had made, and the strength she had found to stand tall in the face of everything that had tried to break her. Her journey wasn't over, but she had reclaimed it. She had done it for herself, and for the people who mattered most. And for the first time in a long while, Helen Davis felt truly free. The legacy she had preserved was not just a collection of assets. It was the spirit of resilience, the gift of self-determination, and the quiet strength to live life on her own terms. The moving truck was parked in front of her new house, its engine humming softly in the early morning light. Helen stood at the threshold, her hands resting on the smooth wood of the doorframe. The house in front of her was smaller than the one she'd spent decades building, but it was hers in a way that felt more real, more peaceful. It was a home free from the weight of betrayal, free from the shadow of the life she had left behind. She had sold her old house months ago, the place where David had once lived, where the accusations had first started. There had been too many memories, too many manipulations tangled in its walls. The decision to leave hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Now, she was ready to begin again. The new house was nestled on a quiet street, tucked away from the hustle of city life. It was small, but it was perfect. Light-filled rooms, a small garden in the back, and a porch where Helen could sit with a cup of tea and let the world move past her. A sanctuary, a fresh start. As the movers carried boxes through the front door, Helen felt a sense of calm settle in her chest. There was no looking back. Everything she had built, everything she had fought for, was here. She could breathe again. A few weeks later, Helen was standing in front of a packed auditorium, the bright lights shining down on her. It was a women's leadership event, and she had been invited to speak about her journey of independence, of reclaiming her life and her power. As she stood at the podium, her notes trembling slightly in her hands, Helen looked out over the audience. The faces before her were filled with expectation, but there was something else there too. Something she had never seen before: respect. She took a deep breath and began. Her voice was steady, clear. "I spent a lot of my life believing that I had to keep the peace, that I had to protect others, especially my son, David. But what I learned through that journey is this: Peace isn't worth anything if you lose yourself in the process. I had to fight for my own peace, for my own freedom. And that's something no one can take away from you, not if you're willing to stand for yourself. Helen's words were met with applause, a wave of support and admiration that washed over her, and she realized something profound. She had been speaking to women who had all faced their own battles, who had fought against expectations, against circumstances, against their own fears. And they saw her not as a victim, but as a woman who had survived, thrived, and made her own path. Later that evening, after the event, Helen received a call from Rachel. The tone in Rachel's voice had shifted over the past months. Gone was the uncertainty, replaced with understanding, warmth, and a quiet, unspoken strength. "Mom, I wanted to say thank you," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "For not giving up, for showing me what it means to stand for yourself. I've been talking to Lily about everything, and I can see how much this has meant to both of us. I don't know if I'd have had the courage to make some of the hard choices you've made, but I'm glad you did. You gave us both the strength to move forward." Helen felt her heart swell. She had feared that, by taking a stand, she had broken something between them. But now she realized that Rachel's understanding was the final piece of her healing. They were no longer bound by the chains of the past, they were moving forward, together. As the months passed, Helen's memoir, detailing her journey of resilience, was published. The book became a bestseller, and she found herself in interviews, on television, sharing the story of her fight to protect her future. The response was overwhelming. Women from all over the world reached out to her, thanking her for giving them the courage to stand up for themselves. In those moments, Helen knew that the battle had never just been for her. It was for every woman who had ever felt silenced, diminished, or controlled. She had fought not just for her legacy, but for theirs as well. David, on the other hand, faded into the background. His attempts to tarnish Helen's reputation had backfired. The public saw him for what he was, a man who had betrayed his mother, manipulated her for his own gain, and tried to turn her strength into weakness. The media moved on, and so did the public. David's voice was no longer relevant, his lies no longer heard. He had been exposed, and in the end, he was the one left standing alone. Helen didn't feel satisfaction in his downfall. There was no joy in seeing him fade away. There was only a quiet sense of finality, knowing that she had made the right choices for herself. She had taken the power back. One day, as Helen sat on the porch of her new home, the sky streaked with the soft colors of the setting sun, Lily arrived to visit. The young woman was home from college for the weekend, her face filled with excitement and a new energy that came from discovering who she was becoming. "Grandma," Lily said, her voice full of enthusiasm, "I've been working on a project for school. It's about legacy, about what we leave behind, and I wanted to ask you for some advice." Helen smiled, motioning for Lily to sit beside her. "Well, first, you need to know that legacy isn't just about the things we leave behind. It's about how we live, how we make choices, how we stand up for what we believe in, no matter the cost." Lily nodded, absorbing every word, her eyes bright with understanding. And as Helen looked at the young woman beside her, she realized that her fight had not been in vain. This was the future she had fought for. The future of those she loved. The future of her own strength. The legacy she had preserved was no longer just about wealth or possessions. It was about the lessons she had passed on, the strength she had instilled, and the peace she had found. Her life was far from over, but in this moment, Helen Davis knew one thing for certain. She had chosen the future she would live, and no one could take that from her. The storm had passed, and in its wake, Helen was ready for whatever came next. The sun filtered softly through the tall windows of Helen's new home, casting delicate shadows across the room. She had always dreamed of living in a place like this, quiet, serene, and all her own. The small house, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, had become her sanctuary. No longer burdened by the weight of betrayal, she could finally breathe without the tension she'd carried for so long. Helen sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, gazing out the window at the small garden she had started planting. It wasn't much yet, just a few flowers, some herbs, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she was taking her time. The frantic energy that had once defined her life was no longer necessary. She had created something steady, something lasting. Her life was unfolding in ways she hadn't anticipated, peacefully, with a rhythm that felt comfortable, nourishing. And as she looked around the room, she realized how much this new life had taken shape. This home was more than walls and furniture. It was the embodiment of everything she had fought for: the quiet strength, the independence, the freedom. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Helen walked across the room, opening the door to reveal Rachel, standing on the porch, her face illuminated by the fading light of the afternoon. There was something different about her now, an ease in her expression, a strength in her posture. Their conversations had changed over the past few months. Rachel had been tentative, unsure of how to navigate her relationships with both her husband and her mother-in-law. But now, Helen could see the weight had lifted from her shoulders too. "Hi, Mom," Rachel said, her voice warm and full of a newfound understanding. Helen smiled and gestured for her to come inside. "It's good to see you, Rachel." They sat down together at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the house around them. After a long silence, Rachel spoke, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the choices you made, the strength you've shown. I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. You've really transformed. I see it. You've made peace with everything that happened, and that's something I admire." Helen felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "I've had to let go of a lot. And not just of David, of a life I thought I had to protect at all costs." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "But it's made room for something better, something real." Rachel nodded, her gaze softening. "You've changed, and so have I. I can see how much you've grown. I can see now that you weren't just protecting yourself. You were protecting the future. Not just yours, but ours too. And Lily's. I can't thank you enough for that." Helen smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "I've always wanted to be strong for you and Lily, to show you what it means to stand firm, no matter what." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that hadn't been there before. They didn't need to say more. Helen had done the hardest part already. She had chosen peace. As the weeks went by, Helen felt her health begin to improve. The tension in her shoulders slowly melted away. She found herself sleeping better, eating better, and most importantly, focusing on things she had long neglected, things she had always dreamed of doing but never had the time or energy for. Writing had always been a passion of hers, but it had taken a backseat to the chaos of her past. Now, with the weight lifted from her shoulders, she finally found the time to write. Her pen moved smoothly across the paper as she worked on a novel she had always wanted to finish, a story of hope, redemption, and the strength of women. She also started traveling again. A trip to the coast, to a quiet little town she'd always loved, was her first adventure. She walked along the beach, letting the salt air clear her mind. For the first time in years, she felt like she had room to breathe, to take in the world again without fear, without regret. But there was one thing Helen knew she had to make peace with, no matter how difficult it was: David would never be part of her life again. As much as it hurt to acknowledge, she had to let go completely. He had crossed too many lines, betrayed her too many times. The mother she had been to him was now a distant memory. It wasn't that she didn't mourn the loss of what could have been. She did. But the damage was irreversible. The hurt had run too deep. David had taken from her in ways she couldn't unsee, couldn't forget. And it had to end. She made peace with that decision, as painful as it was. The ache she felt wasn't just for the son she had lost, but for the mother she had been. A mother who had believed in unconditional love, who had given everything. But now, she was giving everything to herself. Helen's charitable work continued to thrive, as did her legacy. She volunteered at the local charity and helped mentor young women who had faced adversity. Her story had inspired so many, and now she was passing that strength on. Her words, her actions, and her journey had become a beacon of hope for others. One day, as she sat with a group of young women at the charity, sharing her story of resilience, one of them spoke up. "Your story gives us hope, Helen. It shows us that even when we feel like we've lost everything, there's always a way to rise again. Thank you for sharing your strength with us." Helen felt the weight of her journey, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly fulfilled. She had walked through the storm, she had survived it, and now she was sharing her strength with others, one story at a time. Her life had taken many twists and turns, but now, at the heart of it all, there was peace. A peace she had earned. And as the days passed, Helen's world continued to bloom. She had made her choices. She had claimed her future. And in the process, she had found a peace that could never be taken away. No matter what came next, Helen was ready. The storm had passed. And now, the sun was shining. Helen sat quietly at her desk, the late afternoon light spilling over her papers. Her fingers gently brushed the edges of the estate documents she had just revisited, documents that had become her shield, her protection, and her legacy. She had come a long way since the day she first discovered David's betrayal, each step forward a testament to her resolve, her strength, and her will to reclaim her life. But now, as she read through the provisions she had put in place for Lily, her granddaughter, Helen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The will was updated. The trust was secure. Lily, in her quiet, strong way, would always be taken care of, just as she had promised her late husband, Tom. The scholarships in Tom's name, the charitable funds she had established, everything was set for the future. The life Helen had fought for was now preserved, a legacy to be carried forward by the next generation. Helen closed the documents, her heart swelling with pride. She had done more than protect her own future. She had built something that would last beyond her, something that would ripple out into the world and touch others in ways she would never fully see. But she could feel it, her fingerprints on the world, her mark left on the lives she had touched. Weeks passed, and Helen's life continued to unfold with a sense of peace and purpose. The world outside was busy, but in her own space, the days felt soft, like the rustle of leaves in a quiet autumn breeze. She continued her charitable work, offering guidance and support to young women trying to rebuild their lives, sharing her story of resilience, and providing the steady hand of someone who had already walked through the storm. Her message resonated, and she was humbled by the gratitude that came her way. But it was in these moments, helping others, that she found her true joy. And then, one evening, the phone rang. It was Rachel. "Mom," Rachel said, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm so proud of you. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and well, I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see how much you've done for all of us. You've built a life that's not just about what you've earned, but about who you've become." Helen smiled softly, hearing the change in Rachel's tone, the finality of the realization that they had both come through the hardest part. Thank you, Rachel. I couldn't have done it without you. I know, Rachel replied, a hint of emotion in her voice. And I'm so glad I didn't lose you through all of this. We're stronger than we've ever been. Helen felt a deep sense of gratitude. This, too, was part of the legacy she had created. Strength, understanding, and love. A bond that had been tested but had grown stronger through the storm. It was during these quiet months that Helen's story took another unexpected turn. A film studio had reached out, expressing interest in adapting her memoir into a movie. They had been inspired by her journey, her resilience, her fight to reclaim her life, and they wanted to share it with the world. At first, Helen had hesitated. It felt surreal, almost impossible. But as the idea sank in, she realized it wasn't just about telling her story. It was about inspiring others, giving them the courage to stand up for themselves, just as she had done. The film was announced, and soon enough, the world was captivated by her story. Interviews, press tours, the media spotlight. Helen found herself thrust into a new phase of her life. But unlike before, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't playing a part or hiding behind the mask of obligation. She was living her truth, and the world was finally seeing her for the woman she had become. She attended the premiere, dressed simply, but with a quiet strength in her eyes that spoke volumes. As the credits rolled, the theater erupted into applause, and Helen felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't the accolades she sought. It was the recognition that her voice had been heard, that her strength had been seen. At the premiere, she found herself surrounded by friends, by the people who had stood by her when it had been hardest. And in the center of it all was Rachel, standing proudly by her side. I don't know how to thank you, Rachel said softly, looking at her mother-in-law with admiration. You've shown me what it means to really live, to really be free. Helen's heart swelled with pride. We've all earned this, Rachel. We've all fought for it. The final chapter of her journey had been written. Helen had faced unimaginable betrayal, but she had come out the other side stronger, more determined, and more certain of who she was. Her story had touched so many, but more importantly, it had shaped the life she lived every day. There would be no more fear, no more manipulation. She had built a future for herself, and for Lily, and for those who followed in her footsteps. And then, as Helen sat in her quiet home, the world outside now so different from the one she had known, she felt a deep, peaceful stillness within her. She had made her choices. She had lived with intention, with strength, and with love. Her legacy wasn't just about wealth, it was about the power of choice, the importance of resilience, and the strength to rise, no matter how many times you had fallen. Helen had built a life that would endure, one shaped by her decisions, her strength, and her unwavering commitment to herself. Her legacy wasn't just something she had created, it was something she would pass on for generations. And in the quiet of her home, as the last rays of the setting sun cast a golden glow over her world, Helen knew one thing for sure. She had freed herself. And in doing so, she had set herself, and her legacy, on a path that would never be taken from her again. When I was betrayed by my son, I froze the accounts he used, and in doing so, I freed myself, and my legacy, from the grip of greed.